Hello and welcome to the Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. My name is Donald Robertson and today's guest is Matt Sharpe. Matt is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Deakin University in Australia. He's spoken at Stoicon in Athens and he's the co-author of Philosophy as a Way of Life and one of the translators of the selected writings of Pierre Hadot, Philosophy as Practice. His most recent book is titled Stoicism, Bullying and Beyond, How to Keep Your Head When Others Around You Have Lost Theirs and Blame You. That's even longer, Matt, than one of my book titles. I thought I had the record for it. And then there's also the book about the French Enlightenment, which is that out yet or it's coming out soon?
It's just come out this month, yeah.
Hot off the press. So where are you and what's it like there?
I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and pleasingly, for this time of year, it's actually a pretty mild day.
And your dog's eating your puppy's eating your Greek notes.
My puppy's just been eating
Dog's
my
at your
ancient Greek
homework.
verb tables,
Yeah.
but that's been fixed. So a bit of a comic aside for the listeners.
So how did you get here? Well, how did you end up there with your Greek verb tables and all your books about philosophy? Like, how did you start off in this journey? Why didn't you choose a normal career? Like you end up getting into all this stuff.
Well,
where did it all go wrong, Matt?
It's a big question, yeah, isn't it? Why do you get into philosophy? Well, I just sort of was interested in it, like I had a passion for it. And my dad just said, look, if you can keep on doing it and keep on kind of making it work in terms of a scholarship or a potential position, then, I'll back you. And so I sort of did, I finished my PhD in 2002, and then I left the academic space and I was working in the public service, and then I managed to secure the position that I am still in, and ever since then I've just been working as a teacher, a researcher, and I've just always been interested in both philosophy and also, which brings us to the Stoicism, the way that it can matter potentially, not just in our heads and as it were as a professional, but in terms of shaping the ideas that shape people's lives.
That's the interesting part, I think. I mean, that doesn't seem controversial, but I can remember a time when people did think that was controversial. Like, I remember when we started doing Stoic Week, some people, and it was mainly academic philosophers and some classicists, kind of sneered at it a little bit. They were like, philosophy is not meant to be a practical thing. It's, it's the pursuit of truth for its own sake. And you guys are kind of implying that there's some other benefit to doing that. You're kind of tainting philosophy by combining it with bits of psychotherapy. It was sort of the criticism that they made anyway. And I kind of understood where they were coming from. But actually, over the past 10 years, I think more and more people have got behind the idea, which I think is a very old idea. Like, it was the norm in ancient Greece that maybe, philosophy is a therapy in a sense, or, has therapy-like benefits.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've also experienced those responses. You do get a kind of, as you say, a kind of almost scorn for the idea that philosophy might be something that you could take into the marketplace and take into the public square and take into the therapy room at the same time. And this is where Pierre Hadot's work was so profoundly important for me personally, and I know many other people around the world. All of a sudden you've got this really, really high-end classicist philologist who's going back to these texts and just making the observation, which is really quite clear, I think, in so many of those texts, that for the Greeks and for the Romans, particularly in the Stoic and Epicurean school, but even more widely, there just was a sense that, philosophy, like any other human activity, is directed towards conceptions of the good and conceptions of the good life. Socrates is all about that. He's all about what is it that makes a human life worthwhile? What does it make that makes a human life worth living? And philosophy is for him the best way of kind of pursuing an examined and worthwhile life.
Yeah, people who think this is
Hmm.
ridiculous are basically acting as if Socrates was ridiculous because, like, that he is all about that. Like, and actually, he would have thought that academic philosophy that's completely divorced from that, in his eyes, would probably have resembled what the sophists did more, like, or what they used to call heuristics, like, or something like that. For him, well, he didn't think there was that much point in pursuing philosophy unless it improved your character.
Yeah, that's right. And the defense, of course, in the apology is, when he has the opportunity to, it's the second speech where he has the opportunity to kind of potentially placate the people who found him guilty. And he imagines someone saying, well, we'll let you free, Socrates, if you just stop doing
Yeah,
philosophy. And at this point, he just doubles down and says, well,
yeah,
philosophy for me is the pursuit of the good life. I've been trying to assist people, talk to people about what makes for a good life, and I've been asking them to take care of their souls more primarily than to be concerned with money, with status, with power, all of the things that people are still concerned with, and that popular culture still promotes as the necessary ingredients of a good life. And yeah, for him, philosophy was I mean, you mentioned therapy, but it was a way of life, and it was a way of
hmm
improving a person's life, making them more reflective. The unexamined life is not worth living.
yeah,
Asking them to assess what is important and what's worthwhile.
yeah.
And without that, as just a kind of exercise in intellectual gymnastics, which
hmm
philosophy can become, particularly
hmm
once it's sanctioned by certain institutional and
hmm
thereby financial kind of incentives. I think for him, he would have found it quite confusing, and it would be fascinating to
Yeah.
imagine him having some discussions with various representatives of that new way of doing things.
Do you think he would recognise a modern academic philosophy department as, if we beamed him forward in time and we plonked him into like a seminar in a philosophy department today, would he be? Would he think this is it? This is what I was hoping you guys would be doing, or would he be a bit
I think, as
perplexed
I say,
about?
I think he'd be confused. I mean, for a start, so much of it's done by writing. Whether for Socrates,
Not a big fan.
philosophy was something that you need to do between two
Yeah,
people or more people through dialogue. And the written texts are quite long, and whether
yeah.
he was a fan of short question and
He didn't
answer. There's
like, yeah, long speeches and stuff. He goes on
there's
about that.
actually there's a moment in Plato's Protagoras where
Yeah,
Protagoras launches into a fantastic
yeah.
speech, and Socrates just says, "Well, hang on, I just don't work like that.
The Great Discourse.
I'm a lot slower than you are. I really just like to just break things down." And
He pretends he's got a bad memory.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. That's what I mean. And it's quite clear from the text that actually he holds on to a lot.
He's
But
got a
he
good
does he
memory.
does.
So
Uh,
you mentioned Pierre Hadot. I guess we should back up a little bit. And
mm.
could you tell, for the sake of the listeners, could you give them a quick intro to who Pierre Hadot was, and how you discovered him, and why the listeners should be interested in his work?
So Pierre Hadot, which is Hadot, I first heard of him in the context of studies of Michel Foucault, who's a much better known academic figure. And in his later works, Foucault returned to look at classical Greek and Roman philosophy in his own way. And I thought, well, I'll just go back to the source. So I'll go back from that and have a look at this guy Hadot and what's all the fuss about. And so I picked up a book called Philosophy as a Way of Life, and the subtitle I think is something like Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault. And Hadot is, yeah, he's somebody who has a very academic training. His profession was learning how to read old books in multiple languages, and that collection is a series of studies of ancient Greek and Roman texts. And what Hadot discovers is that, and what he claims is that you can't really understand everything that's going on in those texts if you take a modern perspective. You're just looking for kind of technical arguments, claims about the nature of the universe or language and so on. There's this whole other dimension or dimensions which is very clearly about, this is supposed to, this activity of questioning, reflecting, thinking, reasoning, dialoguing, it's actually supposed to change your soul. It's supposed to
Why would anyone want
produce.
to do that?
Well, it's a good question, and I mean, I think many people in the community do want to do that because
Yeah.
the philosophers, as you know, Donald, the Stoics and the Epicureans, they diagnosed that most people are avoidably unhappy because of the beliefs that they form about what they need to be happy. You
They
know,
live
I
lives of
need.
quiet desperation.
Yeah, that's the Pink Floyd line applies. You know, I need the car, I need the job. Now I need the promotion. Now I need the girl. Now I need the other girl. Now I need the kids, and now the kids have got to grow up. You know, there are all these kind of ways in which we make our happiness conditional on things that we can't necessarily control, and that,
Hmm.
as the Epicureans would add, often don't deliver when actually we succeed in getting what we think we want, and then we just feel like, oh, I didn't actually want that at all. And so at that point, you know, the philosophers come in and say, well, maybe the issue is we need to really think about what it is to be human. We need to think about our place in the world, and we need to think about what could genuinely fulfill our natures, given the kinds of creatures that we are. And so philosophy in that light takes on a very practical component. And I think some of what philosophers were doing in that period has made its way into psychology, and of course there are other disciplines as well.
Wow.
And
That's.
one of the kind of scornful responses that we were
Mhm.
discussing before is that I've had when I say, look, I really work on Stoicism, and you know, I'm getting involved with some modern Stoic stuff. Is, oh, that's just psychology. And my inclination is to say, well, sure, absolutely. Um, it's the logos or study of the human psyche,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that's surely something of philosophical note and importance.
Well, do you remember back in the old days when everything was made of wood? Like a long, long time ago, like philosophy and psychology weren't separate disciplines until relatively recently, really until the 19th century. And so it's a weird argument in a way, like because and I don't know, it's a sense, a result of academia, the industrial revolution, the division of labor, or whatever. There's a psychotherapist over there, there's a philosopher over there. It's two different guys. Didn't used to be like that though. Like, these things were integrated. It's kind of artificial schism that we've created between these two disciplines. And it's not like the mind is a separate thing from what we do in philosophy, because we use our minds to do philosophy. Like, and actually, particularly if we look at cognitive therapy works to a large extent at the level of reasoning, and by helping us to identify errors in our reasoning. There's a really obvious overlap with the whole process of engaging in philosophy. But you're talking about something that goes even beyond that in Pierre Hadot, where he's describing not just kind of cognitive intellectual exercises, but even physical or imaginary exercises, perspective shifting, visualization, as part of the repertoire of ancient philosophy. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's another, I guess, point in Haddo's work, which is so interesting, but it's also created certain sort of criticisms. Is, you know, philosophy for Haddo embraced potentially, as you say, forms of exercise that are meant to transform the person so they're able to live out the ideas that they've, theoretically agreed to about the way the world works.
Hmm.
But that aren't just reasoning exercises. So as you point out, imaginary well, imagine, I'm using the imagination. Would be the way I describe. So the view from above exercise, which I know that many listeners will be
Hmm.
familiar with from the Stoic space, is an exercise which I think is perfectly consonant and consistent with Stoic reasoning, for example.
Yeah.
But it involves a process of a person exercising their imagination to visualize, well, if it's true that I'm just one very minute individual in a very large world with lots of other people who all of whom have like and potentially for them just as important concerns, then this matters. But I'm going to visualize that by looking at my life from above and sort of seeing all those other people and seeing myself as kind of like a little ant scurrying around. And so I've got all these things going on this week. I'm really stressed out. I feel like, there's no escape from my own life, and it's sort of really a big kind of cosmic thing. And this exercise is really just taking you out of that and enabling you to realize,
Mhm.
probably even in the scale of your own life most of the time, not always, but most of the time, a lot of the things that really vex us are potentially pretty small. They pass pretty quickly. They don't concern that many people. They won't be remembered. You probably won't remember them in a month or two.
Mhm.
But to get to that sense, you need to be able to take yourself out of the
Mhm.
enormity of what you're experiencing on the inside. And, as I say, a lot of academic philosophers say, oh, that's just psychology. Well, so be it. But you're psychologically, inverted commas, experiencing a philosophical assessment of your life, in ways that just by sitting in a classroom and doing certain technical exercises on the modern model, you're not going to be able to do.
Well, in a sense, you could say it's the psychology of philosophy, if there is such a thing. There's philosophy of psychology, but there's also, in a sense, the psychology of doing philosophy. Now, on the one hand, is you're kind of alluding to, it may be that particularly perspective shifting exercises like the view from above, um, and maybe looking at events from different chronological perspectives or from other people's perspectives or from your own perspective in the future and things like that might allow us to arrive at different insights intellectually or cognitively. But there's another sense in which these things overlap. And I think, if I remember rightly, Hadot alludes to it. And I think Epictetus kind of alludes to it as well, which is that our emotional state has a profound effect on our capacity for reasoning. And this is bread and butter of cognitive therapy. When people are angry or depressed, we know from tons of research that they exhibit predictable cognitive biases. So we can't think straight when we're depressed and when we're angry. And I think the Stoics say that anger is temporary madness. And I think they really understood that if you want to be a philosopher and you want to use reason, then you better learn how to maintain your mental health, because otherwise you're not going to be reasoning very well. And not only is your reasoning going to be distorted, but it's going to be distorted in ways that you're probably not going to be fully aware of, because depressed people don't realize that they have necessarily have a negative cognitive bias, that they're engaged in overgeneralizations and black and white thinking and stuff like that. It's more obvious when we look at other people doing it. We look at someone who's depressed and we think that guy's not thinking straight. He's kind of distorting everything. He's got a lopsided view of events. There may even be philosophers who have developed whole philosophical systems that are
Hmm.
biased by their
Yes. Well,
emotional state.
I think I think that's a really important and profound insight, and it's not something that I think that the modern discipline of philosophy for the last few centuries. We can talk about the early modern guys, because I think the early modern philosophers were all about that. But that kind of assessment of what are the psychological determinants that might influence what I think to be true or persuasive. And, even with a philosophical study, why am I attracted to a particular philosophy? We imagine, or we like to imagine as professionals, that we're pure minds, sort of assessing evidence, as it were, like a chat GPT philosophy
Yeah,
module. But of course, we're not like that. Most kids who come to philosophy in their 18, 19, 20, 21, 20, there's a lot on in their life, biographically.
a lot of hormones,
Yeah, and there's
but
history
stuff
and
like
so on and
that.
so forth. And, they come out at 23, 24, 25, and they're, I don't know, a Heideggerian, a Nietzschean, whatever it might be, a Deleuzian, there are various philosophers, a Lacanian, and so on. And one of the things that I think attracted me to what Hadot was saying was precisely the idea that you were talking about before, Donald, that what if there are preconditions for getting at a wise philosophy in terms of the work that you have to do on yourself? And Foucault, to his credit, who I mentioned before, when he goes back to the ancient Greeks, I think he does pick up on that.
Yeah.
This idea of, well, I need to maybe work on myself to make sure that what I'm bringing to the philosophical table doesn't jaundice what I hold to be true. I don't just pick a philosophy that makes me feel good about myself, given my present value set, my present emotional state, but rather maybe I need to call into question those things and assess whether
Mhm.
they're the most truth conducive. Um,
There's
and
even
it's
one of
it's
the
it's fair to say that I think a lot of the more modern, more technical philosophy, because there is that separation of philosophy and
yeah.
psychology, they don't look at things like cognitive bias, for example, which I know
Mhm.
psychologists have taken up. But
Yeah, like it's a kind of almost undeniable. Like there's tons of research on it, and it's really pretty clear cut in a way. We can document the sort of bias. It's fascinating. We know and also the way that we allocate our attention, which is another factor that influences our thinking. I was going to say in Xenophon's Memorabilia, there's even a little Socratic dialogue where Socrates is talking to a philosophy student who he says is kind of pasty faced and he doesn't get much exercise and stuff. And Socrates kind of, gives this guy a dressing down and says, do you not think that if you want to be a philosopher, you need to look after your physical health as well? And he persuades the guy by saying, look, if your body's unfit, are you not more prone to fevers and things like that and illness? And when you get sick and you have a fever, doesn't that affect your ability to reason?
of
So doesn't it
course,
stand to reason that looking after your body would help you to think more clearly? Like, so why would you, if you really love wisdom and you love the truth, surely it doesn't make sense to neglect your physical health? The two things are connected. And that's straight up his argument. It's only a short dialogue, but it's really crystal clear what the point is that he's making there.
yeah, and
Um,
that's to give the contrast. That's completely outside of the scope. I mean,
yes.
as a teacher, you have a kind of pastoral responsibility, and I think there of course there are many very very good teachers out there, but you would be giving that advice to the student almost not today as a philosopher, but as something else. A good
Yeah.
teacher.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be considered philosophical, whereas clearly in the ancient Greek setting, Socrates doesn't sort of think, "Oh, hang on, I'm just going to step out of being a philosopher now. I'm concerned about your health."
Yeah.
It's just as a philosopher,
Yeah.
if you don't attend to this stuff, you're not going to do a good job. And of course,
I
we
mean,
know that. I mean, as I say to my students, if you think the mind is completely separate from the body,
yeah,
maybe have 8 beers and sort of
exactly.
try and sit down and read a complex text on mathematics and see how you go.
Yeah. Without any sleep, like sit down and read, go a few days without sleep and then try and read Aristotle, or something like that. Obviously, you think, oh, well, that wouldn't be a good idea. Like, I need to be in the right frame of mind to properly understand this stuff, you know?
And what if I think with the Epicurean and Stoic stuff, we're getting a vision of philosophy that suggests that a kind of state of mind, which is roughly like something like serenity or tranquility, and there are different words that are used, is somehow necessary for the most philosophical assessment of the world. If you're doing philosophy in a rush, you're going to have a rushed philosophy.
Yeah.
If you want to take in all the evidence, if you want to roundly consider everything, maybe you've got to open a mental space. But to open the mental space, maybe you've got to do not simply cognitive work, but work on your emotions, work on your way of life, work on your values, what you think are important, because maybe some of the values you're pursuing are stressing you out.
Mhm.
I've got to
Yeah.
get the promotion. I got the promotion. I've got to get the next promotion. And there's a lot in a text like Seneca's on the brevity of life, this idea of we're constantly, I'll be happy just after the next thing's done, and then the
Yeah. I
next
mean,
thing gets done, and then the next thing appears.
it'd be easy to almost all of these things as you're talking about them. Like the point that you've just made is really familiar from modern evidence-based psychotherapy. It's integral to one of the leading protocols for treating clinical depression. Actually, like the almost the identical thing that wouldn't you could have said that in a session doing behavioral activation like for clinical depression, and it wouldn't have seemed out of place at all. It's exactly the sort of point that's integral to that approach. Like, so, I mean, philosophy has in that regard, has a much bigger overlap with psychotherapy, with modern psychotherapy, I think, than many people realize. And that brings me back to Pierre Hadot, actually. And something I wanted to kind of pick your brains about a little bit, because you know Pierre Hadot's writings better than I do. Now, I first discovered Hadot because, in a roundabout way, I was interested in Gnosticism and I was interested in comparative religion as a young guy. And I got into Plotinus and I read Hadot's book,
Mm.
Plotinus on the Simplicity of Vision, right? And that kind of got me then reading his other books, then A Citadel Philosophy as a Way of Life, What is Ancient Philosophy, and more into Stoicism. Um, but what struck me about Hadot was he had a lot to say, interestingly, about the parallels between religion and ancient philosophy. So, philosophy is a way of life he saw as overlapping with early Christian mysticism and Christian contemplative practices in a way that people had kind of underestimated before. He saw there was a kind of organic development of the Christian contemplative practices out of earlier pagan or pre-Christian contemplative practices, but somehow then in philosophy we kind of remove all that, but it remains to some extent in the history of Christianity. And he talked about that. He compares philosophical exercises to spiritual exercises, and it seemed jarring to me. I loved Hadot's work, but something about it seemed really peculiar from my point of view as a psychotherapist, which was that in none of the books that I read by him did he ever mention parallels between these spiritual exercises or contemplative practices and modern psychotherapy. And that seemed glaringly obvious to me.
Mm, mm,
And I wondered if that was because he was French. And let me explain. Because psychoanalysis is more, still to this day, more popular in France, partly because of the kind of intellectual culture there. And cognitive behavioral therapy didn't take off in France and to the extent that it has in America and in the UK, right? And I thought maybe Hadot isn't familiar with other approaches to psychotherapy because he maybe wouldn't see obvious parallels
mm.
between these
Yep.
contemplative
Yep.
exercises and the stuff that's done in Lacanian psychoanalysis or Freudian psychoanalysis. But if he'd seen cognitive behavioral therapy, he wouldn't have been able to resist making analogies. And it seems odd to me that he would say, "Oh, this is just like stuff we find in Christianity," and not say it's also I mean, it's indistinguishable almost from stuff that is common practice in cognitive behavioral therapy. And it really struck me that that was like a major gap in his writings, but I attribute it partly to the culture in which he was working.
Yep. Look, I think you're probably right. I mean, I just sense that he just doesn't know the material. He just doesn't have
Yeah.
access to the material. I mean, I think he was a very generous-minded scholar and open-minded. And if he, as you say, if he was exposed to that material, I think the crossovers are so evident. His second wife, Ilse Hadot, whose book on Seneca I'm slowly translating, she talks more about modern psychology, but and the way that it might, I guess, be conversant with some of the ancient material. She's looking at Seneca as a spiritual director, as somebody who, with
Mhm.
Lucilius, for example, is kind of playing the role of something like we would consider a therapist or a life coach or something like this. But again, I think her models, which I imagine she may well have conveyed to Pierre, were, as you say, they weren't, I think, the kinds of models of psychology that you're thinking about. They were more probably post-Freudian depth
Yeah.
psychology kind of approaches.
Like most university departments, when they think about psychotherapy, they still think about like Freud and depth psychology and stuff like that, which is weird because among many clinical psychologists, not everywhere, but in many places, particularly in the UK, that's seen as a kind of historical artifact. Like that's like alchemy or something. It's like a whole different era. Like it's gone
Mm.
now. Like the kind of era of depth psychology. So it's very far behind the times in a sense. Um, but I mean, if I could speak to Pierre Hadot, I would have said to him very simply that Albert Ellis, who was the original pioneer of cognitive therapy, and cognitive therapy is now the leading evidence based form of modern psychotherapy, Ellis said that Stoicism was the philosophical inspiration for what he did. And he mentions the Stoics and the Epicureans many times
Mm.
throughout his writings, very explicitly, like drawing on them. He even draws inspiration from Plato's Apology as well. So there's a very explicit connection.
Yeah.
And Aaron T. Beck, who's the most famous kind of early researcher in cognitive therapy, pioneer of CBT for depression, also explicitly says that Stoicism was the original philosophical inspiration. That's the phrase that he used for cognitive behavioral therapy. So, yeah, I don't think he Hadot probably just wasn't even aware that these guys explicitly saw Stoic philosophy, and maybe Hellenistic philosophy more generally, as the direct precursor
Yeah,
of
the
what they
kind
were
of
doing,
a set of sources and
and quoted it.
people to talk to, if you like. Yeah, I mean, I think what you say is correct. You know, I think if Haddo had known of people like Ellis and so on, I think he would have really sincerely engaged in it, because he's very clear that ancient philosophy is therapeutic. You know, and what starts a person on an Epicurean or Stoic journey is a sense that their life isn't going as well as it might be. But what the philosopher then intervenes and says is, well, as we've talked about, well, you need to change your beliefs. You need to reflect upon your beliefs, your values, your desires, your wishes, your aversions, and
Mm.
let's check those out and let's have a look at those, and let's think our way through them, and talk our way through them, and see if we can't recognize that some of them might be based on mistaken orientations, that philosophy can redirect you to a
I'm,
different vision of what's important.
Matt, I'm going to tell you something not a lot of people know about the history of psychotherapy, because I'm a bit of a nerd about it, right? Like, so it's kind of one of my favorite subjects. So I would make the case that CBT was originally inspired. Ellis, in particular, quotes the Stoics a lot. However, there's another guy that everyone's forgotten about, like, except massive nerds about the subject like me, right? Freud was not the only show in town at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of psychotherapy. He had a rival. Like, there was a guy called Paul Dubois, who was a Swiss neurologist. He was very famous at the turn of the century. And he presented a psychotherapeutic system that was very popular, very widespread in the UK and America and throughout Europe, called rational psychotherapy, or sometimes it was called persuasion psychotherapy. It spawned many variations, and it was the main rival for Freudian psychoanalysis for decades, maybe roughly almost half a century before it fizzled out completely. And Paul Dubois, Ellis was quite into Epictetus, right? He doesn't mention Seneca. He talks about Marcus Aurelius a bit. Paul Dubois was really into Seneca, and he would prescribe reading Seneca's letters to his patients.
Mm.
And actually, the bits of Seneca that he draws on are the bits that CBT's doesn't mention as much. So he talks a lot about the dichotomy of control, and he talks a lot about determinism, funnily enough, and the therapeutic value of having a more deterministic outlook. Because Dubois thinks it allows people to be more forgiving. You know, he thinks if we're determinists, then if somebody's rude to us, we think, well, they were rude for a reason. Like, it's their genetics and upbringing and stuff like that. And he thinks if you kind of think that way and you understand that there's a lot of antecedent causes that have led to someone's obnoxious behavior, then it prevents you kind of blaming them in a sort
Yeah,
of
that's
emotional, like
right. Yeah.
you think about it in a more reasonable way. You think,
Mm.
you kind of think, well, they don't know
Sounds
any
like
better.
ideas in the early modern philosopher Spinoza. You know,
Yeah, like much like
if someone gets involved in a road rage incident with you, if you're able
yeah, yeah,
to reason that probably there's a whole series of causal chains that are
exactly.
making that person feel very bad about themselves in
So,
this moment, and then acting out in the way that they have, then you are likely to be less heated up yourself and more able to be forgiving.
I think so.
Whereas precisely if we don't think through where the other person might be coming from and what might be shaping what they're doing, then we're more inclined, paradoxically, maybe, to sort of be somehow upset, and to blame them, and to take exception to what they're doing, and to experience anger, and
I'm
with it
gonna
the desire for revenge and retribution and so on.
I'll do a lot of a bit of a deep dive for a second and make a kind of technical point about this psychologically, which is that we know that when people are angry or depressed or anxious, they tend to focus on individual stimuli that exacerbate their feelings, right?
Mm,
So if somebody's anxious, they'll look for signs of danger in their environment and kind of put them under a magnifying glass and ignore possible signs of safety that might be in their environment. So they get really focused in, like,
mm,
on individual things that distress them. Whereas if somebody has a broader perspective, they're responding to multiple competing stimuli. So there might be things like a sharp knife that evokes feelings of danger, but then there might be friends that are protecting you that evoke feelings of safety. And so you end up with a more nuanced, complex, and balanced emotional response, right? And so if you're looking at someone and they call you a name, call you a rude name, Matt, like they would never do that. But like if they kind of said, if you were to say, Donald, you're an idiot or something like that, like, and I just think he's just doing that out of pure malice. Then I'm concentrating my mind like a magnifying glass on the idea of pure malice as your
Mm,
motive. And so my
mm,
emotional response is going to be to that monolithic idea. But if I think, well, Matt said a bunch of things over. Sometimes he said nice things, sometimes he said not, and it may be that he talks to other people like that, but sometimes he doesn't. And I have a more rounded and balanced understanding of your motives and your background. Then I'm taking in lots of competing stimuli, like, and they're going to balance
mm.
each other out. Like,
And
it's not just
that's meaningfully a more philosophical way of looking at it, right?
yeah, like
It's a truer way
it's more
because
truthful.
it's very rare for people to be motivated by pure malice.
It's a
I mean,
multifactorial perspective,
mm,
like where we think that there are multiple things that combine. There's genetics, education, upbringing, like
amount of
you know,
sleep,
amount of sleep,
recent
your
bereavement.
hormones, yeah, your
Um,
cognitive biases. Like, and when I think about that, like, I have different emotional responses to each of these things. And so they combine together and kind of balance each other out in a more nuanced and rounded emotional response
yeah, and
compared to,
this is the kind of psychological background I think for a real criticism of a lot of the social media that we have and the way that
totally.
with all of the algorithms they also are working to focus in on particular environmental data that confirm a perspective and sort of push that perspective into a more extreme and simplified lens which as you say also involves screening out all of this other stuff. It's just that they're doing this. They're motivated by pure malice. There's a great danger. It's quite immediate. We have to do something about it. We've got to talk about it together and share this feeling and share this lens on the world that's showing up the other in this way. And it produces polarization as people have talked about and it produces the potential for incivility and for a less complex set of political possibilities that are
Is all
ultimately
of this in your book on bullying?
what's that?
Is this in your book on bullying?
No, it's not unrelated, but it's I'm just more thinking through the
Politics in
situation we
general.
find ourselves in politically. I mean, less so I think in my country than in other more notable countries around the world. Um, but definitely, I mean, there are real crossovers in terms of all of these subjects, and the crossovers concern this thing we've been talking about, which is that what are the preconditions of having a philosophical perspective? And someone like Hadot directs us to think, well, maybe they are really there's quite a few of them, and as you say, they might be biological, they could be psychological, um, and and our historical setting, our political setting also shapes the kinds of positions that we take, and also our technologies. If our experiences of the world are mediated by technologies, and those technologies are shunting us into certain ways of thinking, then we oughtn't to be surprised to see more and more of the kinds of polarization and anger and distrust that you can see unfolding in certain political cultures.
In that case, do you think there are parallels between the role or the problem that Socrates and other philosophers saw with political orators and sophists in classical Athens and the problem that we currently encounter with the news media, politicians, and social media and influence? I guess social media influencers to me seem, in a
It's a
sense,
kind of rhetoric,
sophist.
isn't it? It's
Yeah.
a very artful, often very artful, presentation of an idea, um, in such a way that it can be very convincing, but it can also be very partial, of course, because when you're pushing a particular perspective or trying to sell a particular product, there are certain kinds of information you want to screen out, and there's
And these,
only certain kinds of information you want to include.
there's
I
definitely an
always say to my
obvious some.
student, the problems with rhetoric. Imagine this: you have to give a speech at your best
Mhm.
friend's 21st. This is not the time to really delve into what might be real. That maybe this person is like all of us, limited, flawed, and on occasion has acted badly and acted poorly. This is not the occasion. A 21st speech is a laudatory speech. What we want to hear
Mhm.
about, and what the person, in a sense, in this setting deserves to hear about, is the good things that they've done, the good experiences that you've shared. So rhetoric it's a technique,
Mhm.
and from a Stoic perspective, any technique, because it's not yet virtue, can be used for good or evil. And of course, that's
Mhm.
Socrates' perspective. So, from a Stoic perspective, should we say, social media is all bad? No, it's a medium, and it's in between good and evil, but it sure as hell can be used for both.
Yeah. And maybe some of the ways that it uses. I mean, I see philosophy in some regards as ancient philosophy, in a sense. I think evolved in part as a way of helping people to counter certain effects of rhetoric, to help them spot fallacies, for example, and to realize when they were being duped by demagogues and or intellectual charlatans, like maybe some of the sophists, for example, to kind of see through misleading arguments and the use of the art of persuasion. And that would be very relevant, you would think, today when we're with because the sophists are in our living room, like they're like in our pocket. We carry them
I
around in our pocket in our mobile phones. They
Yeah,
can't, they've
yeah,
sneaked up on us. You
yeah.
used to have to go to the academy, or to a wealthy gentleman's house in Athens to hear a sophist speak. But now they're in your mobile phone, in your pocket, and on your
Oh,
laptop, like everywhere else.
they'd love social media. I think
They've
it's
infiltrated our homes with
yeah,
their
absolutely,
rhetoric.
yeah. Well, in the ancient world, as many of your listeners will know, adult education, as we would call it, was really from early on. The rhetoricians were the first game in town, and then the philosophers came along. And as you say, the philosophers were responding, as we see so vividly in the Gorgias and various other of the Platonic dialogues, which are based on exchanges that Socrates has with sophists like Hippias or Protagoras or indeed Gorgias. So quite literally, if you wanted to do adult education beyond the kind of basic curriculum in your adolescence, you would either go to a rhetorician school
Hmm.
or you would go to a philosopher's school.
Hmm.
And with someone like Socrates, as you say, you're seeing a critical ethos being developed and a set of critical analytic tools to work out, well, that sounds really good. I'm excited about it. But is that an argument for it relative to the claims that it's making about the world? I hear a lot of students say when they get into a philosopher, I really like this person's philosophy. And the
Yeah,
Socrates in me goes, that's not really relevant. Do you think
yeah,
it's true? And do we always think that what we like and what is true are, kind of coincident? I can think of all kinds of situations in which we might like a lot of stuff which is flattering,
yeah,
but not
yeah,
true. Makes me
yeah.
feel good about myself. Matt, you're an amazing guy. You know all the best people. You're a genius. Flattering, probably not true.
Well, what do you call an expert in telling people things that they like to hear? I mean that's rhetoric, like that's sophistry. And social media, because of the very way it functions. I think actually the ancient sophists. Let me take a step back. Had competitions, and in a sense, they would indirectly compete with each other because they were in a kind of marketplace,
Hmm.
being paid fees, different varying fees for their work, but also they would literally have competitions against one another. You kind of see this in the symposium, even where people give different speeches about the nature of love, and it's kind of like a bit of fun and games, but sometimes it
Mm.
also became more competitive and more serious.
Yep.
And social media does something like that as well, based on likes and the way that the algorithms function. So, Socrates thought this was dangerous because people would learn to tell the audience what they wanted to hear,
Mm.
like, and whatever got the biggest round of applause and whatever commanded the highest fees.
Yep.
After a while, sophists are going to stop speaking the truth if people don't like it and don't want to pay them for it. But we have the same problem today with social media influencers who say things that they quickly learn are going to get more views. And so we get clickbait,
Yeah,
like, and we
that's
get
right.
sensationalism,
Mm.
and we get rage farming and
Yes,
stuff like that.
rage
Because if you
farming.
want
Yeah,
people's
wow.
attention, you make them
Yeah,
scared and angry.
yeah. And so this is one of the reasons why I wanted to work a little bit on the thinking of the French Enlightenment, because I mean, I think that period of intellectual history has been terribly misunderstood on both elements of the left and elements of the right. Um, and the book is framed really around their bases. Their basic starting point is in early modern thinkers like Francis Bacon, John Locke, and a guy called
Mhm.
Pierre. And they were all about analyzing how the human mind works to screen in and screen out. They're interested in cognitive bias. So
Yeah.
Francis Bacon talks about the idols of the human mind.
Mhm.
And the first one of them is really what we would call cognitive bias. We screen the environment for ideas that are pleasing to us,
Mhm.
or that might activate certain kinds of emotion. And then we screen out what he calls negative instances, which are
Mhm.
ideas or examples or stories that might contradict where we've gone with our ideas. Or
Mhm.
else we turn on the spokespeople of those negative instances.
Mhm.
We attack the person. We go ad hominem, as the philosophers would say.
Shoot the messenger.
Yeah, that's right. And for Bacon, unless we became aware of the idols of the human mind, what became science wouldn't become possible, because he was one of the proponents and celebrants of what became the modern scientific idea. And you had to become aware of the idols of the mind, your tendency to believe flattering, oversimple, often over extreme ideas, to become aware that when you're investigating any subject, that's all going to be constantly presenting itself and pushing you to sort the ideas in particular directions. And a new form of understanding of the natural and social world, he believed, was only going to be possible once we'd made that analysis and once we'd produced inquirers who were trained to self-assess. And then that gets picked up by Locke and Pierre Bayle, and then it's taken into figures like Voltaire and Diderot, who become the kind of key proponents of the French Enlightenment. And I think they would be, sadly, very, very concerned about elements of modern popular culture as really taking us back into the kinds of fanaticism that they were concerned to oppose.
I definitely think so. Like, I mean, what's the connection, just to tie up a couple of different themes that we've been talking about? So, to what extent did those thinkers draw upon ancient philosophy, in particular Stoicism?
I think they were all still. They may have been. This may be the last period in which amongst the kind of intellectual elites. Of course, education was still, by our standards, very restricted. That
Mhm.
always needs to be recognised. But within that restricted sphere, I think that those generations of the 18th century and into the early 19th were the last in which they had a continuous kind of exposure and familiarity with a lot of the philosophy that the modern Stoicism movement, for example, is bringing back via the Renaissance. They all knew their Stoics, they all knew their Epicureans, they all knew their Plato, they all knew their Aristotle. Diderot, for example, his last book
Mhm.
was on Seneca. It
Mhm.
was a long introduction to a new translation that had been made, well, the first French language translation that had been made of Seneca's oeuvre. And so in that introduction, which becomes a book, he just goes through each of the texts and sort of undertakes to respond to them on the basis of his own concerns and so on, so forth. But Voltaire was a huge fan of Marcus Aurelius. He was a huge
Mm-hmm.
fan of Epictetus, actually,
Mm-hmm.
a huge fan of Seneca. And, again, I think they were still within that culture which recognized that. So, for example, Voltaire's main bugbear is what he calls fanaticism.
Mm-hmm.
Fanaticism is the passionate, excited embrace of an idea that may not be true, but which you become fanatical about. It's quite exciting, you've got this new idea and you passionately identify with it. And then, of course, you act in certain ways towards those who don't embrace that idea. So fanaticism often has a flip side, which is persecution of those who don't agree. You're so convinced that this idea is true and wonderful that you either try to convert others, and if they don't wish to convert, you move into a kind of more persecutory mode. The philosophy, he says here in an entry in his philosophical dictionary, is the only cure for fanaticism. It's a very ancient conception, because philosophy can enable you to sort of say to yourself, well, this is exciting, but is it true? This is a view of the good life, but what kinds of behaviors does it promote towards these other people, who aren't Protestants?
Mm-hmm.
So his treatise on toleration, for example, starts with this awful story of Eugene Calas, who was the father of a young guy in a fiercely Catholic town, and his son had committed suicide, and the Catholic fanatics in that town got it into his head that the father had killed the son because the son was going to convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, and this is all false. And he ended up being lynched. By this kind of Catholic mob, who are evincing what Voltaire calls fanaticism.
Mm-hmm.
They selected the data in the environment, young man in a vulnerable situation, committing suicide, distressing situation. They projected onto that a series of ideas. Bad people are always going to act in such a way, and they acted out on that. And this, for Voltaire, was precisely the kind of action that we want to prevent in a more enlightened society. And I look at some cases of behaviour where extremists are again acting out in the modern world, and I really worry that Voltaire would think we haven't really got ourselves sorted out regarding fanaticism. We've still got
Matt, we still have Christian sectarian violence in Scotland, parts of Scotland, and Glasgow, in Northern Ireland, and like in places like Belfast and Glasgow to some
and
extent.
we still have non-Christian forms of extremism. I was thinking about the Pizzagate story. This guy
Oh yeah.
convinced by social media that there's this nefarious plot centering on a pizza place in, was it DC, and going in
Mm-hmm.
loaded up with a shotgun.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little
Um,
joke about that actually. When I was a kid and I grew up in the west coast of Scotland in a place called Ayrshire, like it's predominantly Protestant. There was a few Catholics and stuff. But if people wanted to kind of start an argument with you, they'd sort of ask you whether you're Protestant or Catholic. And when I was a young guy, I was getting into philosophy and I kind of flirted with Buddhism and like I started studying Hindu, the Upanishads and stuff like that. And I thought it was kind of cool, like when I was 17 or something. And one of the local tough guys said to me, are you a Protestant or a Catholic? Which is usually how a kind of fight starts. And I said, I thought I'd been clever. And I said, actually, I'm a Buddhist. Like, and he said, aye, but you're a Protestant Buddhist or a Catholic Buddhist? Because his tiny mind could only comprehend two
yeah,
possibilities.
well, I mean that's the kind of thought process that someone like Bacon's going to, any new data has to get fitted into our existing
Yeah.
categories. So are you a Protestant? I mean, it's a lovely response. Are you a Protestant Buddhist or a Catholic Buddhist? It's a great question.
You have to be one or the other, right? Like, but this is so. Yeah, this idea of cognitive biases. We know a great deal from psychological research now. but it's kind of implicit in a lot of ancient philosophy. The whole point of the Socratic method and of philosophical dialectic and logic is to try and get us beyond
Mm,
these biases. And
yes.
I think of ancient philosophy, starting with the natural philosophers. I think of the basic construct underlying a great deal of ancient philosophy is the distinction between appearance and reality. It's always been a kind of motif in the Western philosophical tradition and in the East. But even with the natural philosophers, they were all about saying, when there's thunder and lightning, you guys think it's the gods or whatever, but maybe it's not as it appears, and it's caused by some kind of physical phenomena. And so they're constantly getting people to question appearances
Mm.
and look beyond them for a more naturalistic
And I think
explanation.
that's a really important distinction for the distinction between sophists and philosophers.
Yeah,
Sophists are manipulators of appearances. They have a certain kind of wisdom,
exactly.
or at least a technical craft, which is what are people
Uh-huh.
going to like? What are they going to buy? Given what I want to do with this class, this audience, and so on. Whereas
Well,
the
man,
Socratic
man is the
perspective,
measure of all things. Supposedly, Protagoras said, at least in the Theaetetus,
hmm,
the man is the measure of all things gets interpreted as the idea that appearance is truth.
yep. Whether Socrates is as you say, he's going to conduct a dialogue with you that gets you to examine whether what you're saying might be true. And
Hmm.
the older I get, the more I appreciate Socrates, and because I think what he's doing in those kind of those dialogues where nothing seems to happen, just somebody has an opinion, and then Socrates breaks it down, and the dialogue ends at the point where it's often called aporia, like a dead end.
Hmm.
But I
Hmm.
think what Socrates is doing by questioning a person, getting them to challenge their own beliefs, and he asks them to speak truthfully. They must only express what they think is true.
Yeah.
He's trying to get them to see that from within, as it were, the space of their own ego, they're holding contradictory beliefs, and give them the opportunity, once they've had that recognition, to go down a different path. And a lot of characters, their ego just takes over when they realize that they've been made to look like a fool. Their ego kicks back in, and they walk away. And
They
they
get
they
annoyed.
accuse Socrates of just being a nasty person and kind of
Hmm.
persecuting them. And then there are some characters who go, well, that's really interesting. Socrates has led me through questioning to realize that I thought I knew a lot of stuff, and actually I don't know it, and I hold contradictory opinions, and maybe I've got some work to do. And
Some people find it liberating.
that's right, yeah. And I really feel that as a teacher, you can see this with students. It's a great methodology. And the kind of lecture paradigm we often work with, because it's not dialogic, it's more like Protagoras. You get up in front of the class and here's 50 minutes. It doesn't allow you to do that.
Mm.
Whereas if you run a class Socratically, you get students to own their own opinions and examine their own opinions. And this becomes more like a spiritual exercise, as Hadot would say, because
Mm.
potentially they might come out of that experience with a different set of possibilities and ideas than they went in.
More
Whereas with a
open-minded.
lecture, you're just basically giving them another worldview, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And Socrates thought the danger with lectures was the same as the danger with oracles and the danger with books. Like he said, you're not able to question. You end up just rote learning things.
Mm.
But to really understand, you have to be able to question the person that's making the pronouncement.
And that's I think that's spot on. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on over the last decades, as I reflect on my own education within the kind of modern system, is you're taught to admire an author, for example, and you become a
Mhm.
follower of an author. But an author makes hundreds of different claims. So when you're admiring an author, you kind of bundle them all together and you say
Yeah,
they're mine. And this is a really unsocratic thing, because every
yeah.
human is likely to say a bunch of stuff that is true and valid and well thought out, and
Hmm.
probably a bunch of stuff that isn't. But if I'm
Hmm.
just a Robertsonian or a
Hmm.
Sharpian, then I'm encouraged to
Yeah,
buy the whole bundle.
yeah. Hook, line, and
And
sinker. The whole
and
thing.
again, I think the Socratic method enables you to say, you've written a book and there's 80 claims. We're just going to talk about each of them,
But it's worse than that, Matt. It's worse than that because you might say something that's true in a particular context, but it might end up being true. For example, you might say Donald Water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. And that might be true most of the time.
Under certain
And
atmospheric conditions, yeah.
unless you're in the Alps or whatever, like, and then at a different altitude, it boils at a different temperature. Like, and so often, I think Socrates was aware of this, that verbal formula can hold true most of the time. But then you find yourself in he was all about encouraging people to spot exceptions
Yeah, and that's
to rules or
super
definitions.
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's Bacon says that science will begin, in a sense, when we're capable of generating methodologies that prime inquirers to look for stuff that contradicts their beliefs.
Yeah.
And you get that with Popper and the idea of falsifiability. What makes a theory scientific is that it is in principle able to be. It makes a series of claims that you could test and you could be wrong.
Yeah.
And a position's not like that when it's like, here's my world vision and there's nothing you can say that I can't accommodate in that vision. That's psychologically comforting for me if I've got that vision, but it's not scientifically sound. And it's not going to enable intellectual change, intellectual development, or intellectual growth.
I'll tell you a piece of psychological research that you might find interesting, and it's particularly referenced in the acceptance and commitment therapy, or like ACT literature. So there are studies on rule following behavior. Now, like, rule following is actually a topic in itself in linguistic philosophy and modern philosophy, but rule following in psychology, one of the most notorious studies shows that if you have two groups and they have to perform a task like pressing a button a certain number of times, and they get a reward if they do it properly, but if they do it wrong, maybe they get an electric shock or like some kind of punishment or something like that. And so you have one group who have to figure out the right way of doing it through trial and error, and then you have another group who are told verbally, or they're given instructions on a piece of
This is the
paper.
way to do it.
It
Yeah.
says this is the way to do it, and then you get the reward, right? So this is stage one of the experiment. In stage two of the experiment, the rules change. And so it used to be that you press the button 3 times to get a reward. Now you have to press it 4 times, right? Now the group that figured it out themselves through trial and error learning, when the rules change, like, it used to work when they pressed the button 3 times. Now when they do that, they get an electric shock. So it doesn't take them long to think, maybe we need to try something else. And they adapt more quickly to the change in the environment, right? However, the other group, who were given a bit of paper saying you have to press the button 3 times, will continue far longer to follow the
Wow.
old rule,
Yeah.
even though it's no longer working for them, and they might even get punished for doing it. Now, the reason that's so interesting for psychologists is one of the big enigmas of psychotherapy is, why do people continue to use coping strategies that are
That aren't
clearly not
working.
working for them? And one reason may be that they've acquired the knowledge verbally, and they treat it as a rigid, rule governed piece of behavior. Whereas if they figured it out more from trial and error learning, they would be more primed to adapt their behavior when the coping strategy no longer seems to be working. Now, that reminds me of the difference between Socrates and the sophists, because the sophists taught people verbal formulas. They would just stand and lecture them, and they would say, justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies, or whatever. Wisdom consists in realizing that man is the measure of all things. And people would write that down and go, that's really clever, I'll go away and memorize that. But Socrates didn't give stock answers like that. He encouraged people to try and figure it out for themselves. They had to go through the process of a form of trial and error learning, like you could see the Socratic method as, and that has a subtle benefit, that when they're in a situation and the rule no longer seems to apply, they would be more likely naturally to adapt to the exception. Whereas someone who'd learned it from a book or an oracle or an orator would be more likely to continue try. So Socrates gives the example in Xenophon's Memorabilia of somebody who he asks to define what constitutes justice or injustice. And they say, well, injustice would be lying. And Socrates says, sure, but what about if you're an elected general and you lie to the enemy? And they say, okay,
Yep.
well, that's different. That's different then, right? So
Then you have to come
maybe,
up with a new revised
yeah, yeah.
understanding. I mean,
Whereas
it's going to accommodate. Yeah.
somebody who thinks no, lying is always wrong, like even in
Mm,
that
mm,
situation,
mm,
has
mm.
maybe got an overly rigid conception of it. Then
Yeah, that's Immanuel
maybe they read
Kant's
it in the
conception.
Bible, or
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Mm.
you know, so they're wedded to a role that doesn't actually apply anymore in this unusual. But what seems like an exceptional circumstance might actually become the norm if your environment changes. You
Yep.
get recruited into the army, like now you have to follow different rules. You're in a different environment. All of a sudden, different rules apply. For instance, or you have kids. Like so now maybe you're in a different environment and different rules of communication suddenly apply.
Yeah,
What works
absolutely.
in the military doesn't really work when you're talking to your 2-year-old. Like so I think this idea
Maybe
about
there are crossovers there.
there might be some parallels. Like maybe some things that work in both situations. But definitely I think the Socratic method is more like know-how rather than knowing that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it reminds me of
And you have
trial and error.
you have to sort of do it. You have to participate in it. And there are these funny moments in the dialogues where Socrates says, I really am going to insist that you say what you think is true.
Mhm.
There's no point in going ahead with this if you're just going to say what you think is going to please me.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so a character like Callicles in the Gorgias, who is a sophist, a fairly formidable sophist, at a certain point he just gets frustrated with Socrates showing up that he has contradictory beliefs. And he just says, I'm just going to say whatever you think is true, Socrates. And Socrates says, no, it's not going to work like that. We may as well stop talking at this point if you're just going to try to please me. Which is, of course, what a lot of us perhaps want to hear at different times in our lives when we're
yeah.
conversing with others. But for Socrates, it's precisely that makes the game of the dialogue not philosophical anymore.
It brings us back, I guess, to this idea of sophistry, and this would be the saying what someone wants to, what you think they want to hear is again kind of giving the appearance of engaging in dialectic rather than actually engaging in dialectic. So I think it brings us full circle, and maybe that's a good point at which to wrap things up for today. Um, I think we already mentioned your latest, but we mentioned your book on bullying and also the book that you have about the French Enlightenment. I wondered if you wanted to. When is that book out again?
So the book on the Enlightenment's just come out
Uh-huh.
with Roman and Littlefield. Um, a series called Off the Fence. But the book on bullying, came out last year. And obviously different topics, but we've been talking, I think, about some of the reasons why someone who's interested in Stoicism might
Yeah.
come to the French Enlighteners, both because they're interested in and working in some cases on Stoic ideas, but also because I think they belong to that same tradition of philosophy as post-Socratic and as about trying to do work on ourselves potentially individually, but also maybe as a society to become more truthful and more flexible. It sounds easy.
But there's a
A lot of it
problem.
is about thinking independently, but thinking independently can also go badly. It's also
Yeah.
thinking with a set of truth productive standards that you recognize and that you hold yourself accountable to. Because people who believe in all sorts of weird stuff think that they're thinking independently at times.
I think increasingly so. Like there's a
So
there's a lot of
one of the
that.
things about in the Enlightenment book that I really talk about is this idea of self-estrangement, which is actually a Stoic
Uh-huh.
exercise.
Yeah.
It's what would other people say about what we're doing? you
Yeah.
know, we disagree with them, but what do they think about us? And that's a
Absolutely.
really important step, I think, in a lot of Enlightenment thinking, which we often don't take. It's just here's our
Yeah.
view; the other people can put up with it.
I
We're
think it's a
right;
very
they're wrong.
important step
Mm.
psychologically and modern therapy as well, like similar to things that we would do in cognitive therapy. But what's the biggest obstacle, Matt, that people are going to encounter when they come to purchase this book?
The biggest obstacle is going to potentially be that it's with a more or less academic press, and this means that the price is pretty high. There is an ebook version of the other Enlightenment, which I of course would recommend for people, which is like more like 45 US rather than the other thing.
They
Um,
can get it from the library. If the library don't, it's the sort of book they should tell their library to stock, like
yeah,
to get a
that's
copy of
right,
it.
that's why the academic price is so high because it does go to libraries. It's just a shame because I think one of the issues that we're dealing with, we talked a lot about different issues, of course, but I think the universities have both isolated themselves and sort of been isolated a little bit from public debate, which goes on.
Yeah.
And one of the really exciting things I found about modern Stoicism is it pushes back on that, because it says here's a philosophy, but it's not going to stay there, behind the price walls, behind the sort of the walls of the university world. It's going to speak to ordinary people. And for me, and we've talked about it not for other academics, that's always been an exciting prospect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get it out there. People are thinking, they're philosophical animals. Everybody thinks they're right. Everybody thinks they have true beliefs. And everybody wants to, I think, reflect upon their experience to different degrees.
Mhm.
So it's a shame to me that the universities have taken this path and been shunted along it as well.
Well, allegedly, according to Plato, Socrates said at his trial, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Socrates went into the Agora and encouraged slaves and women and people from all walks of society to do philosophy. But Plato retreated to the groves of academe and mainly talked to privileged young men for some strange reason. And Plato seems to have believed that philosophy wasn't necessarily for everybody.
Yeah.
It was kind of for an elite. But on the basis of Socrates' own remarks, as quoted by Plato, that would imply that those people who are not suited to philosophy, like who don't get into the groves of academe, their lives aren't worth living. Like
Mm.
from what Socrates had said. So there's, to me, in Plato's own writings, there's this real clash
Yeah,
between
I
these
agree.
two
Yeah.
ideas about whether everyone should be doing philosophy or
Mm.
whether it's kind of more of a for an elite. And I'm
I
with
think I think
Socrates;
I
it's for
think
everyone.
I think we're in a moment where we need to be more Socratic and less Platonic.
Yeah,
If the opposition is set up in that way, I think academic philosophy needs to think about becoming more Socratic. If it's going to kind of flourish, um, because it's not as though we're facing less philosophical and wider issues as a human kind of species right now.
mm,
We're really pushing against big questions in the way that we always have, and there are new big questions.
yeah,
So we
definitely.
need to have a thoughtful population and thoughtful policymakers. We don't need to have the thoughtful people just talking to each other in a very refined environment.
Yeah, ancient philosophy. It's the future, right? Or it needs to be. So, anyway, thank you very much, Matt. That's been a really enjoyable discussion. I had a great time, and I'm sure that the listeners did as well. So, once more, it's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and goodbye from my guest, Matt
Thanks for
Sharpe.
having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks everybody for listening.